right, welcome back, everybody, to Emma's Pearls. We have with us Spencer McBride and Kim. So, Kim, do you want to introduce our guest?
Absolutely. Yes, today we're grateful to have Spencer McBride with us. He's currently an associate managing historian of the Joseph Smith Papers Project, and he specializes in how religion shaped public life, political culture, and the ideas of liberty in the early United States. So, so
Great.
happy to have you.
So, Spencer, we wanted to talk to you today about Joseph Smith running for president and how that all came about. Will you kind of educate us and let us know what happened and why he ran for president?
Yeah, it's this fascinating episode in Joseph's life, of course, but also in kind of the broader history of the Latter-day Saints. Is this idea that in 1844 Joseph Smith declared himself a candidate for the presidency of the United States. And I knew this growing up, like my father told me, oh yeah, Joseph Smith was a candidate for president in 1844. And that's about all I knew. It was this kind of point of trivia. And then when I was in college, I was studying, American political history, American religious history, and I listened to a professor talk a little more about it. And at that point, I knew enough about the political atmosphere of the 1840s to say I'm not sure that's exactly right. Now, I don't want to be the kid in class that raises his hand and like says, "Oh, professor, I think you got that wrong." But it did lead me down this kind of path of inquiry, and it was always just kind of a side interest for me. I went to grad school, I wrote my dissertation on a different subject, but I often thought in my mind, I would love to really dive deep into this and one day maybe even write a book. And then when I find myself out of grad school working for the Joseph Smith Papers, every single day, it seemed, a new document was coming to my desk that we were preparing for publication that was focused on Joseph Smith and politics. And so I said, if this isn't the time to do it, I don't know when it is, because it's just aligning with my work so perfectly. So the story goes something like this. Most of your listeners will know that the Latter-day Saints faced immense persecution in Missouri, and that a lot of that persecution continued in Illinois. Illinois at first was a very hospitable place, but with each passing year, it seemed to get more and more inhospitable. And so by late 1843, Joseph is worried, along with other church leaders, that what happened in Missouri might happen again. And so they begin looking at all the different avenues of recourse, of protection against this happening again. And this included writing to each member of every politician who was expected to run for president in the upcoming election year. And they wrote essentially the same letter to all five men. What would be your course of action toward us as a people if you were elected president, was the gist of the letter.
Now, one of those was Martin Van Buren, right?
That's right. And Joseph had a history with Martin Van Buren. In 1839, he went to D.C. to ask Congress for redress and reparations for the Saints' lost property in Missouri. And Van Buren refused to support the petitioning effort, not out of any prejudice against the Latter-day Saints, but he believed that it wasn't the role of the federal government to get involved. He believed it was a state's issue. And Joseph Smith is essentially saying, guys, it was a state that expelled us. The federal government needs to hold the state accountable. And so Van Buren does not write back. The man who'd been Van Buren's vice president was also expected to run for president. He doesn't write back. Henry Clay writes back and gives this answer that essentially says, I don't want to make any promises that I'm held accountable for if I'm president, but you can know that I'm a friend of the saints. And that wasn't enough for Joseph. And then you had Lewis Cass and John Calhoun each write back and essentially said, we feel for you. We don't want you to be persecuted, but we actually feel the federal government shouldn't do anything for you out of a matter of like governing principle. And so at the end of the day, Joseph realizes we're not going to get any help from these five presidential candidates. Doesn't matter who's elected. So we need to support someone else. And ultimately that leads to Joseph declaring his candidacy.
Okay, so can I ask something here?
Sure.
Okay, so Joseph was raised on patriotism. He was raised on stories of his grandparents fighting the Revolutionary War for liberty and justice, and then having having gone and went through the stages of appealing for redress, and to hear what he heard, that'd be devastating for him. And it's just it can just show you how it influenced his decision. That was the only choice he had. Am I right? For running for president. If they're not going to do anything for me, I have to do something myself.
Yeah, and in fact, I think you're right on there because one of the things he did leading up to his candidacy is he wrote a letter that became a pamphlet called General Smith's Appeal to the Green Mountain Boys.
Uh,
And essentially saying, hey, I'm a Vermonter. I was born in Vermont. If there's any people in the United States that are known for loving freedom and for standing up for freedom, it's Vermont. And he's hearkening back to the Revolutionary era of Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys. And he's essentially saying, hey, our tradition, at least the part of the tradition, the American tradition that we should be holding on to, is standing up for freedom when it's being taken away. And yeah, I really don't think Joseph Smith had just any naked presidential ambitions. Now this is something that's very common today, and it was common then too for a politician to say, I'm not really interested in the power that comes with being in office. I just want to help people. And the reality is a lot of those people are in fact quite interested in the power. But we look at Joseph Smith's case, and I really believe that he would have stayed away from politics if he had been able to lead his people and minister to them and with them in peace.
Yeah,
It,
didn't he say, I would not have suffered my name to have been used by my friends on any wise as President of the United States or candidate for that office if I and my friends could have had the privilege of enjoying our religious and civil rights as American citizens, even those rights which the Constitution guarantees unto all her citizens alike.
yeah, absolutely. And that kind of encapsulates this idea, right? Joseph Smith isn't this, power hungry politician who the top goal is presidency of the United States. He is running, as you said, Kim, because they're kind of running out of options. And now this wasn't their only option that was left, but their options were dwindling in number, and this was one of the few available to them. And they were going to put all these irons on the fire and hope that one of them worked.
right. So W. Phelps helped Joseph draft his views on the powers and policy of the government of the United States. So what can you share with us about some of those platforms? Because a lot of them was about helping people.
Yes. So the way I've often put it in writing about this and in speaking about this is one issue drove Joseph Smith into the presidential race, and that was religious freedom. That the federal government should be empowered to protect religious minorities when states failed to do so. That was his one issue. But it's very easy for people to become one issue candidates. And Joseph Smith was not. One issue drove him into the race. But the political platform that he presented to the public was a robust platform. And it talked about a lot of issues that were very relevant to the United States at that time. And I'll share a few with you. He weighs in on the slavery question. And in the United States at this time, you had people arguing that not only was slavery right, but that it was also necessary. And you had people arguing against slavery. And even those who were arguing, the abolitionists were divided. Should we end slavery all at once, or should we be satisfied with gradual abolition? And Joseph Smith comes up with this really unique idea, at least unique doing it on a national level, and that is paid emancipation, where you purchase the freedom of enslaved men, women, and children. Now, that concept wasn't necessarily new. Members of the Quaker faith had been doing that at an individual or family level for many, many years. They might say, hey, I'm going to buy this individual's freedom, and in a few years when I've saved up enough money, I'm going to buy another person's freedom, and one by one we're going to free as many enslaved people as we can. Joseph Smith saying that the federal government should purchase their freedom from the proceeds of sales of Western lands, And this was really in some ways a compromise, because the staunch abolitionists would say no person should be a slave because no person should ever be able to own a person. And buying somebody's freedom is a tacit acknowledgement that in that moment they are property. And what Joseph is essentially saying is, I'm going to make this temporary ideological compromise of purchasing their freedom, because at the end of the day, it's worth it, because there will be no more slavery in the United States. And so he's calling for an immediate end to slavery through paid emancipation at a national scale. That's revolutionary. He is also calling for territorial expansion, which a lot of people were doing at the time. And he sees the United States not just going to the Pacific Ocean, but also into Canada and Mexico. But those territorial expansion questions always got caught up in the slavery question. If we expand west, does slavery go with the expansion? And Joseph's essentially saying, well, if we end slavery, that's not an issue, and then we can go ahead and spread as far as we need to spread. He's calling for banking reform. And the United States at this time had gotten rid of the second bank of the United States, which meant it was particularly susceptible to extreme periods of boom and bust. And without something regulating the U.S. economy, the booms were really good and the busts were really bad. But the problem, the outcry against the earlier efforts to have central banks, was that they were serving the interests of the wealthy who wanted to invest. And so Joseph's idea of a national bank is, this is purely civil service. Those who work in the bank will get paid $2 per day for their work. This bank will exist to help the economy of the United States for everyone, and no one's going to get rich off of this public service. He's calling for, of course, religious freedom, of a constitutional change, or a change in how it's interpreted, that the federal government can help minority religious groups when states fail to do so. Of course, that's there in this platform. And it goes on and on, but this political platform that he wrote with William W. Phelps is robust, and it hits at all these different questions that were on the minds of Americans at that time. And in many cases, he's offering very novel solutions.
So what are some of the negative consequences of these platforms?
Yeah, so I mean, I think sometimes people look at it and say that's a nice idea, but what does it actually look like in its implementation? And I'll give you one example that maybe fits that bill. Joseph Smith calls for prison reform. And he looks at the American criminal justice system, which ideally is a mix of punishment for crimes committed and reform. And this is at the beginning of the penitentiary movement. And he's looking at how jails and prisons are running in the United States, and he goes, this is completely out of balance. People are being, it's so weighed toward the punitive that you're essentially creating a permanent criminal class. Now, those aren't his words. That's the gist of what he's saying. And so he's saying we have to reform this system. And the only people that should really be imprisoned are those guilty of murder. That every other crime can be addressed with, labor in the community and some component of reform. And so, yes, there's punishment for wrongdoing, but we're also going to focus on reforming the wrongdoers. And it's this idea of we should be spending way more money on what he calls seminaries of learning, or essentially schools. He's this early voice for build more schools, not more prisons. And this is a great idea. It's a tender idea. It shows one who has a social conscience. He's one who's thinking about the social welfare and how criminal justice system sometimes punishes people unjustly for the circumstances in which they were raised. And I think that speaks to a lot of people who read his platform today. And he never really tells us how he would accomplish this, because what does this mean? Can you make this change overnight, or is there chaos all of a sudden? If all of a sudden you close all the prisons and say everyone who's in here for everything except for murder, you can go free, does that bring chaos into society? And so it's this like noble idea he put forth, but he's a little bit short on ideas of implementation, if
Right.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
I also wanted, I'm curious, when did he, it's not called the application. Oh my gosh, I've run and I cannot remember the correct term. So, announce his candidacy. And then when did he have time to run and
Yeah.
do any of that?
And so the American political system is a little different now than it was then. You essentially just had to say, I'm a candidate, or have someone say you're a candidate and you just had to say, you had to not correct them. Um, and there were processes for getting on the ballot in each of the states, but those varied by states. And so the way it happened is there was a meeting of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles and other church leaders in Nauvoo in late January 1844. They've received all these letters from these potential presidential candidates, and they say, Joseph Smith, you should be our candidate. He accepts the nomination. Within a little over a week, his pamphlet comes out on February 7th, and they mail that to every member of the Supreme Court. They mail it to most of the members of Congress, the members of the president's cabinet, and they start printing more and more editions of General Smith's views. And this is a time when political campaigning, especially at the presidential level, was shifting. We weren't quite at the day where candidates made stump speeches, where they went around the country at different campaign stops and said very directly, this is why you should vote for me. Instead, they sent their surrogates to do it for them. Now, there was a time during, when the country was founded where you wouldn't even direct your surrogates. In fact, if you were a candidate for president, you needed to appear like you didn't want it and that this was something others wanted you to do. Even if you did want it, you had to pretend like you didn't. And Joseph's in this kind of transition period where you still don't want to openly campaign for yourself, but you do have surrogates and people you can send out to do the campaigning for you. And Joseph Smith had an advantage that most independent candidates did not have. Because if you were at that time, if you were a Democrat or a Whig, you had the party machinery behind you, and that was a huge help. But if you were an independent candidate, you didn't have that. But what Joseph had was a core of seasoned missionaries. And these were men who knew how to go and canvass an area, canvass a community, and talk to people to get by on little money and on the charity of strangers. And essentially, they call hundreds of men to serve electioneering missionaries. And one woman goes with her husband and becomes an electioneering missionary in that way as well. And they go around the country and they distribute Joseph's political pamphlet. They hold political meetings. They plan to hold a nominating convention in each and every state. So Joseph Smith can stay in Nauvoo and send people out to do the campaigning. And I think one of my favorite, there's two stories I think that really stand out to me that are fascinating. Brigham Young and Wilford Woodruff and others are in New England. They're in the Boston area. And they hold one of these campaign meetings. And there are hecklers in the crowd. And the police are called. And then fighting breaks out, not between the Latter-day Saints and their hecklers, but between the hecklers and the police. And now I love Boston, and I hope I'm not offending any of your listeners from Boston, but can you think of anything more Boston than a political meeting that results in the hecklers fighting and brawling with the police? And that happens during this campaign. Another fascinating one is in the South, in Tennessee. A mob surrounds the electioneering missionaries, threatening violence, not because they are Latter-day Saints, but because Joseph Smith's political pamphlet calls for the end of slavery. And in Tennessee and many other southern states, there are laws on the books that say you cannot distribute abolitionist material. And they deemed Joseph Smith's political pamphlet abolitionist material, abolitionist literature. And so they were shut down by a mob, not because of their beliefs in terms of religion, but because of their push for the end of slavery.
Huh. Interesting. And is that also because Joseph, I believe, stated something to the effect of, "Oh, I might be president." Like he seemed to have a lot of popularity.
So this is an interesting question because I think two questions naturally arise. Was he serious, and could he have won? Joseph Smith was very serious about his campaign. He took his issues seriously. He saw it as one possible avenue for protecting the Latter-day Saints and their freedoms. But I think he was very realistic that the chances of him being elected president were slim to nil. Yet at times he says these things such as, when I read the Eastern papers, meaning the papers from the Eastern United States, I'm worried that I might be elected. And these are one of those moments where it's really hard to tell Joseph's tone. Is he joking? Is he serious? Because a lot of the Eastern papers were very critical of him. And so is this his way of being kind of sarcastic or tongue-in-cheek? Say, hey, when I read the Eastern papers, I'm worried I might get elected, when in fact the Eastern papers weren't saying flattering things about him. And we know Joseph had a sense of humor. It's really clear in a lot of surviving documents. And sometimes if someone doesn't know he has a sense of humor and they read everything that's in print as dead serious, you kind of miss some of this man's beautiful character. Like for instance, Josiah Quincy and Charles Francis Adams, two prominent men from Boston who were sons of prominent politicians, come to Nauvoo during the campaign. And they're riding in a coach with Joseph Smith. And they begin asking about the next presidential election. And John Tyler was the current president, but he was so unpopular that even his own party had kicked him out of their party. And so it was obvious that John Tyler, who was technically a candidate, wasn't going to win. And so they say to Joseph Smith, who's going to be the next president of the United States? And his answer is, well, I am a prophet, and I can tell you that John Tyler will not be president. Now, someone who doesn't know about Joseph's character, doesn't have a sense that this guy can make jokes. He can prophesy in the name of the Lord, and he can teach these deep gospel truths with sincerity. And he can also make jokes and be lighthearted as he does it. They'll say, hey, Joseph Smith prophesied that John Tyler wasn't going to be president. Well, okay, but he was stating the obvious. It's saying, hey, this is the most unpopular politician in America right now. I prophesy that he won't be president. He's clearly, to those that know his personality and are familiar with him through his documents, this is Joseph Smith being lighthearted and making jokes. And so this is all to say he was very serious about his campaign. But I also get the sense that he recognized that there were real limitations. And there were possibilities that, and we see this a lot in American politics, a third party candidate doesn't necessarily run to win, but they run to draw one or the other party to include the matters that are important to them. And so maybe they could say, hey, the Latter-day Saints have a candidate. He's not going to win, but he may take enough Whig voters that the Whigs are going to lose. The Whigs should make some concessions to him and take some of his matters and put it on their platform, or vice versa with the Democrats. Joseph never explicitly says that's what he's doing, but I think there is a sense among some of his supporters that if the Whigs came up and said, hey, you know what, we should really take some of his platform and incorporate into our own, that he would have been on board with that.
One of the things that really floored me when I read when Joseph and Eliza Higbee go to address Congress, and they're in all these different meetings and have to wait, they go into great detail about the things that happened in Missouri, right down to the murders and the violation of the women. Great detail. And you would think these politicians would be swayed or moved by that and want to help. But How much did this being close to an election year weigh in on their decisions of whether or not to get involved?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And in 1839, Joseph and Elias Higbee are there in November. And so the election's going to be the following year. And they explain this. And this is a time when there's a great sensitivity to the way people described violence and particularly sexual violence. The United States was a violent place at this time. Violence was common. But the way you talked about it was always kind of with euphemisms or for instance, you wouldn't say the word rape in print. But that's exactly what happened for many women in the Missouri persecutions. And so they find every way of saying it without, you know, going against kind of the sensitivities of the day. But in the petition they give to Congress, which you can find in the Joseph Smith papers, they're actually really pushing that line, and on purpose, because it's almost as if they're trying to say, why don't you people see how bad this is? Let us tell you exactly what happened so you can see that we're not like sugar, like this shouldn't be sugar coated. You need to understand what happened. And I think there were members of Congress who were compassionate toward that. There were probably members of Congress that would have liked to have helped, and there are others who maybe wanted the problem to go away, or the Latter-day Saints weren't a big enough, voter bloc to be of their concern. But I think what really sticks in Joseph Smith's side for the rest of his life is Martin Van Buren's answer, because he never explicitly says, "I won't help you," but in the White House, Joseph and Elias Higbee give the president several letters of recommendation from local political leaders that explain their situation. And according to their record, he puts them down. He puts these letters down and says, "What can I do? I can't do anything for you. If I do anything, I will come in contact with the state of Missouri." And what that means is 1840 was an election year. And Van Buren wasn't the most popular president. He had a real chance of winning re-election, but it was going to be close. And Missouri was one of the only states that he could count on. Missouri was very squarely in his electoral column.
Yeah.
And if he came out in favor of the Latter-day Saints, he worried that he would lose the electoral votes of the state of Missouri. And you can imagine how that makes Joseph feel, and saying you're not going to speak up because it will hurt your re-election chances. And Joseph has this very noble sense of politics at this time. And when I write about this in my book, I call it the shattering of American idealism. Joseph had this sense that our politicians are elected to do right and to serve the people and to do what's in the best interest of the people. And here's a politician who's essentially saying, "I'm not going to help you because it would hurt my re-election." And Joseph never forgets that. And the wording of the quote changes with retellings. The most popular version of it is "Gentlemen, your cause is just, but I can do nothing for you." And all the way up even into 1844, Joseph from time to time is recalling this meeting in the White House. And it is very formative to his own work in the federal political system.
It seems to be a thing in the political system up to 2025.
Yeah, I mean, like, right. This isn't new to us.
Chris for me. Yeah.
And but I think sometimes we even see that today, right? Like people will have this very idealized version of American politics, and then they maybe start paying closer attention. And it's not uncommon for someone's idealism to be shattered once they start looking closely at how things are happening.
Oh, yeah.
No matter what side of the metaphorical aisle that they fall on.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's super disheartening for Joseph, I'm sure. It sounds like it was just rough.
Yeah.
And will you talk about, I know he had a running mate or somebody that was considered to be his running mate, but it didn't work out.
Yeah, this is interesting. A presidential ticket needs a vice president, and the vice president can't be from the same state at that time. And so he begins seeking out a vice presidential candidate. And the first person they approach is a man named James Arlington Bennett. Now, he was a prominent man in Long Island, New York. He made a good deal of his living from an accounting book that he wrote on how basic accounting practices, and it was wildly popular for training accountants, and it was in multiple editions. And that's going to come up here. I know that seems like a weird detail, but it's relevant. Um, and he had struck up an ongoing correspondence with Joseph. He had actually joined the church, but had explained to Joseph that, he sympathized with the people, but didn't necessarily believe their theological claims. And so they write to see, hey, you're prominent. Would you join this ticket? And there was some question, though, about where he was born, about whether James Arlington Bennett had been born in the United States or not. And you had to be born in the United States to serve as vice president. And they can't get to the bottom of it before they move on to another candidate. But it turns out James Arlington Bennett had been born in the United States. But to get a copyright more easily in the United Kingdom, if you were born in the United Kingdom, it was easier to get a copyright. And there was a story going around that he had been born in the UK. And he just never corrected the story because it was helpful for his process. So he's out of the running. They turned to a man named Solomon Copeland, who was a member of the state legislature in Tennessee. His wife had joined the church, and two enslaved men on their property that the Copelands enslaved had also joined the church. And Solomon Copeland was friendly to the church, friendly to Wilford Woodruff, but was not a Latter-day Saint himself. He never responds to their invitation. But it is this fascinating invitation because Joseph's campaign is calling for the end of slavery, and they invite someone who is an enslaver to join their ticket. And I have all sorts of questions why. And I have no answers to that. I have lots of speculation to that, but I can't actually tell you what they were thinking.
Now I'm curious because didn't Joseph was a slave owner? I mean, though in journals they were like family, so it wasn't necessarily a slave. So I don't know if he owned them. 'Cause I
You-
know he bought a boy named Mose,
Um,
but he just was part of the family, and it was to save him from a rough situation.
yeah, I would need to check this. I'm not aware of Joseph and Emma as enslavers or as slave owners as they would have been termed then. Joseph had an interesting and evolving relationship with his ideas on race. We see early on that in many ways he was a product of his time and place of white culture at that time. But as we go on, we see as he learns more and gains more experience, his teachings on race evolve to levels that are more and more in line with what we see today. This isn't to say that he was entirely ahead of his time, because there were others who were much farther along in pushing for racial equality than Joseph was. But we do see an evolution in Joseph's ideas on race. Why he would invite an enslaver to join his ticket may be that, hey, we are going to end slavery, so come join the ticket and help me end slavery. But that's ultimately just speculation on my part. And at the end of the day, they need a vice presidential candidate. They're running out of time. And so Sidney Rigdon accepts the nomination to be Joseph's vice presidential candidate. But he lives in Nauvoo, which means he needs to go reestablish his residency in a different state. And that's why Sidney Rigdon quickly moves to Pennsylvania to do that. And so looking ahead, following the martyrdom, people say, why did it take, where was Sidney Rigdon during all of this? Well, Sidney Rigdon was in Pennsylvania so that he could run for vice president. And that's ultimately who they decide on as a running mate.
So do you believe that Joseph's bid for presidency added to the momentum that eventually led to his death?
Yeah, it's a good question because sometimes people ask, was he? I mean, he has an Joseph. Sorry, I'm going to start that again. Joseph Smith has a distinction in American history that nobody would want, and that is the first assassinated presidential candidate. Now, there's an asterisk there. He was not assassinated because he was a presidential candidate. A few scholars have tried to make the argument that that was the primary motivation for the martyrdom, was to stop him from becoming president. And I see no compelling evidence that he really stood a chance of winning or that the martyrdom was about stopping his candidacy. But there were political components, political motivations to those who sought to murder Joseph the prophet. And that had way more to do with local politics. As you and most of your listeners probably know, is one of the frequent criticisms of Joseph Smith in Nauvoo is that he held too much power, and more specifically that he combined religious power and political power, which was seen as a very dangerous thing among certain segments of the American population. And so where does his presidential candidacy fit into this? I think it's fair to say, and that there are sources that back up this idea, that they saw Joseph Smith running for president as a sign that his thirst for power was unquenchable. And so how might running for president have contributed to his assassination, to his martyrdom? I wouldn't say that people did this to stop him from winning the presidency, but his critics who criticized him for his use of power saw this as a sign that this man is never going to stop. Therefore, we need to take matters into our own hands. So, yes, he was the first assassinated presidential candidate in American history. But again, that asterisk being he wasn't assassinated to prevent his election.
Can you, when I was reading your book, I noticed, Elias Higbee, for those who don't know a lot of the history with the Higbees, between them and Joseph, Elias is not the same person who turned against Joseph with William Law. So I just want to, who were the two different Higbees here? Who was
Yeah.
Elias?
So Elias Higbee was a close friend of Joseph Smith, a faithful Latter-day Saint, and in Nauvoo he became a justice of the peace, and so he had this, kind of civic office that he held. And when when Elias Higbee dies, Joseph Smith preaches a funeral service, or a funeral sermon for him, and says glowing things about his friend Elias. Elias's sons, at least two of them, Francis and Chauncey, eventually have a very strong falling out with Joseph Smith in Nauvoo and are very much associated with the Laws and those others who become known as dissenters in Nauvoo and contribute to the animosity in the region that ultimately culminates in Joseph's assassination. Now, interestingly enough, Elias Higbee is on that trip to Washington, D.C. in 1839 that is so formative to Joseph Smith's political thought and later actions. But also with him is Robert D. Foster. And Robert D. Foster at this time was a physician, and Sidney Rigdon was very sick when they made this trip out to Washington, D.C. And so they brought Robert D. Foster along to treat Sidney Rigdon as his physician. And Robert D. Foster was a faithful, strong member of the church at this time. But he's on this trip to Washington, D.C., and he is very much with the Higbee boys and the Laws in this group of dissenters in Nauvoo in 1844.
Will you go through the timeline of when Joseph decided or announced his candidacy, and then I'm assuming he went first to the White House, then nothing happened, then that's when he announced the candidacy, and then Did he take any other trips to Washington?
This was his only trip to Washington, D.C. in 1839, 1840. The Latter-day Saints make this in-person appeal with a written petition for redress and reparations for their lost property in Missouri. They estimated at about $2 million in 1838, 1839 money. And Congress has a special hearing in the Senate Judiciary Committee. And the question is, does Congress even have jurisdiction in this case? And ultimately they decide that they do not. Well, Joseph is back in Nauvoo. They're still frustrated. And every single year up until his death, the Latter-day Saints send another petition to Congress asking for the same thing. They're not going to stop. And there's a revelation that had come after the expulsion of the Saints from Jackson County, Missouri, that uses the parable of the unjust judge as their kind of path for redress, saying go to the judge, and if he doesn't help you, go to the governor, and if the governor doesn't help you, go to the president, and if he doesn't help you, then God will step in and vex the nation. And so they very much have this idea that even if we keep getting told no, we are going to do all we can to receive earthly redress, knowing that when our God has deemed it enough, he will step in and give us and make right what was done wrong. And so they send that in 41, and in 42, 43, they start writing appeals to a lot of the individual states. That's where we get Joseph Smith's letter to the people of Vermont in pamphlet form. This is also when they begin looking at kind of novel or innovative ways of protecting their rights. Joseph Smith and the Council of 50 send a petition to Congress to form a 100,000-man army of volunteers to protect wagon trains moving to the Oregon country. And if Joseph Smith is placed as general of this army, they can help protect these wagon trains. But also, if the mobs come against the people in Nauvoo, he is now able to use the United States Army to protect the Latter-day Saints. It's at this time that they also make a petition to Congress to make Washington, D.C. a federal city, almost like Washington, D.C. So all of a sudden, Nauvoo, under this petition, would no longer be part of Illinois. It would be under the control of the federal government, so that if mobs came against the Saints, the president could then send troops. Because this is just all sticking in Joseph's mind. The federal government said no because they don't have jurisdiction. Let's find ways to give them jurisdiction to help us. And so all these types of petitions, all these kind of avenues for protection are happening at the same time. The presidential campaign is just one of those avenues. And it seems that Joseph is of the mind that just one of them has to work. And if one of them works, we will be protected, and that's what matters. And one other that they had was a petition that the government give them what they called a liberal tract of land in the West, where they could move out of and not be residents of any state in the country, but to live in federal territory where the federal government could protect them. And they even had conversations about leaving the United States altogether, and had entered negotiations with Sam Houston, the president of the Republic of Texas, saying perhaps there's land in Texas that we could occupy and leave the United States altogether. So yeah, we're really talking 1839 until his death in 1844 is when this is all going on. But the presidential campaign is really just end of January 44 until his death in June. So it's just a few months.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. That was a lot in just a few months. And so regarding like their campaign, I'm sure they would have had, posters and flyers, and I don't know if they had buttons back then, but is there anything that exists from that time period, that promotional material for his presidency?
Yeah, it's a good question. This was, again, at that kind of transition period of modern campaigns. We weren't quite into the campaigns we would recognize today. There was a lot more literature than there was posters or signs. And so Joseph Smith's campaign pamphlet missionaries would go to their assigned areas, and they might bring one or two copies, maybe a bundle of copies. But one of the first things they would do is go to a local printer and get a bunch of copies printed in the area they were going to be distributing them. They would hold campaign rallies. But one of the most fascinating artifacts or documents coming out of this campaign is a newspaper. It was very common for a political party to have a newspaper or newspapers plural that supported their point of view. And so a group of men led by a man named Sam Brannan began a presidential campaign newspaper in New York City called The Prophet. And this newspaper was meant to promote Joseph Smith's campaign. And it was common in those days for newspapers to go to other newspapers, and they need content. And so they find a story in another newspaper and they print it in their own. And this was designed for, circulation of Joseph Smith's ideas. And where the story becomes really like fascinating in kind of a fun trivia or fun fact way. This is going to make you a hit at your next dinner party, let me tell you. Sam Brannan prints Joseph Smith's campaign newspaper on his printing press in New York City. He ultimately goes west with the Latter-day Saints, but he does it by ship, on the ship Brooklyn, and goes around to San Francisco. And Sam Brannan never joins the Saints in Utah, but he lives in California. And when gold is discovered in California, the newspaper that announces the discovery that leads to the California Gold Rush is printed by Sam Brannan on the very same press that he used for Joseph Smith's presidential campaign newspaper. And so again, if that's not going to make you a hit at your next dinner party, I don't know what will. But maybe that's one of my favorite pieces of trivia from all of this.
So what do we, I have to wonder what Emma is doing during all this and what her thoughts are during this time in their lives, and what is her participation? Do we know? Do we have any record?
Yeah, this is one of those areas where, and like so much, right? Like we want to know more about Emma. We want to know Emma more deeply. We want to understand her, get some insights into her mind. And we just lament that there aren't as many written records from Emma or even about Emma from this time. And as far as I know, at no point does she really share her opinion on the presidential campaign. Of course, there's those later conversations and interviews she does with Joseph Smith III, her son, that kind of capture a lot of her thoughts and her remembrances and recollections. But as far as I know, there's nothing on this campaign. What I imagine Emma's thinking is probably along the line of all these other efforts at redress and reparations and protections. That's ultimately what's driving this. The saints believe they should be able to practice their religion in peace without harassment from violent mobs. And they're not being allowed to do that. And they are trying all these different avenues for protection, hoping that any one of them works. And that's where this campaign fits. So I feel pretty confident in surmising that Emma is supportive of any avenue for protection that is going to work. Right. And if it means Joseph becomes president, or more likely runs for president, and that leads to a political party kind of taking on their platform, I would imagine that she would be supportive of that. But we don't see her as a political participant. At least we have no record of that.
Thank you.
Although it just came to me, I will say, and I begin my book on this topic with this scene. The day that they held the nominating convention in Nauvoo, Emma was sick. And so here is this political convention that turns into a party at the end and a celebration of Joseph Smith, their candidate. And Joseph leaves early, not because he doesn't care about his candidacy, but because Emma's not well, she's sick. And he determines on this night that's supposed to be about him, that he would step away from the spotlight and go and be with his beloved wife, Emma. And of course, then after the convention is over and people are still celebratory, they go to the mansion house in Nauvoo and they light a barrel of tar in front of it. And Joseph comes out and they pick Joseph up, put on their shoulders, and they march him around the barrel of tar a few times and set him back down. That's their way of celebrating. But I do think it's noteworthy that Joseph, on a night that was in many ways about him, stepped out of the spotlight for a moment to be with his wife.
Oh, that's really cool. Um, Trying to think of any other questions between him running. Are there any other stories that were kind of unique about him running for president or things that he did in that capacity?
You know, it is the word that gets used for this campaign a lot of time is quixotic, right? It's fascinating because it's unexpected. Joseph Smith ran for president. You know, did he have a chance to win? Was he serious? All these things. You get these stories of his electioneering missionaries who care very deeply about the prophet and care very deeply about their religious freedom and doing what they have to protect it. I think one of the most interesting things that happens is actually has to do with the present maybe more than the past. I think people, when they find out that I studied deeply and wrote a book on this, ask me essentially, what would Joseph Smith think today about politics, or where would he fit in politically today? You want to talk about a dangerous question. My goodness, that's a dangerous question. I mean, like etiquette books tell us not to talk about religion and politics and polite company. And that question like merges the two. But I'll tell you kind of the way I've come to answer that question. Because Joseph didn't really fit in the political system of his time. He didn't fit with the Whig Party. He didn't fit with the Democratic Party. He was very much an independent political thinker. There were things in each party's platform that he would have aligned with, but he didn't subscribe to any one political system. But one of the consistent themes in Joseph Smith's political pamphlet is care for the marginalized in society. That the protections of the United States Constitution, which is a document that he revered, should apply to everybody, regardless of class, regardless of race. Let's find a way for the system to work for everybody. And there is this deep compassion in Joseph Smith's politics that transcends party. There's this deep care for the marginalized in society that transcends party identity. And I think that's maybe one of the most notable and noble things about Joseph Smith's ultimately ill-fated presidential campaign is we get a glimpse into his character a bit. That he's running for president, but the way he ran for president shows him as a very compassionate, caring, and thoughtful individual. And maybe that's something that often gets lost in the story of could he have won? Would he have won had he lived to election day? And maybe one of the more important questions is what do we learn about Joseph and the early Latter-day Saints from this campaign? And that question may be more useful or more helpful than the questions of could he have won?
Yeah, I often wonder if he had won, probably unlikely, but had he have won, what could have changed? He probably would have had the protections of being president that would have prevented a martyrdom and more support to protect the saints. And I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable to surmise. I sometimes imagine the scenario in which surprises, he wins. I imagine he would have had a very difficult time governing because, I mean, it's hard enough for a president who even his party controls both houses of Congress to get things done, then and now. Imagine being a president that comes from neither party, and neither party in Congress wants to play ball with your platform, I think it would have been a very frustrating experience for him to actually try to govern as
Yeah.
president. But I do think it's a fair speculation that the Saints would have received far more protection than they received, and maybe even protected enough to stay in Nauvoo.
Yeah. It's very interesting to think about. Kim, do you have any other questions?
No, yeah, well, yeah, I got 1,000 questions, but there's this thing called time limit. But no, this was amazing. It was very, uh, yeah, a lot of information that a lot of people need to know about. So I'm grateful you shared this with us today.
Well, it was my pleasure. I thank you for inviting me. It was a great joy to be able to talk about it with you.
Thank you. And maybe we'll call on you again and get all those other questions answered that Kim has.
Great. Yeah, happy to help.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us, and we will see you next time.